Good morning and welcome to Immersion 2012, Bridging Contexts for a Multilingual World, CARLA's 4th International Conference on Language Immersion Education. My name is Tara Fortune, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the CARLA staff and on behalf of the Planning Committee. This morning, we will listen to a wonderful plenary with Donna Christian, and to introduce Donna is one of the University of Minnesota's PhD students in Second Languages and Cultures Education, Kathleen Mitchell.
Donna Christian has long been affiliated with the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C. She was president of CAL for 16 years until 2010. Currently, she is senior fellow there and a senior advisor to CAL's Heritage Languages Initiative and bilingual biliteracy research programs. Over the span of her decades-long career, Dr. Christian's research and publications have focused largely on the role of language in education, with a particular interest in two-way immersion education. And though immersion folks may not be as familiar with her other writings, she has also written substantially on dialect and dialect diversity. And it wasn't until I was looking through her biography that I realized that the first book that I ever read of Donna Christian's was called Appalachian Speech. It was published in 1976. And so it's just nice to know that we have these other lives and other interests that also influence our interest in immersion. Much more recently, Dr. Christian co-edited with Dee Teddick and Tara Fortune the 2011 volume on immersion education, practices, policies, and possibilities, and wrote a chapter on dual language education in the Handbook of Research in Second Language Teaching and Learning. Other recent publications include Dialects in Schools and Communities, a second edition, Educating English Language Learners with Fred Genesee, Catherine Lindholm Leary, and William Saunders, What Teachers Need to Know About Language, co-edited with Carolyn Adger and Catherine Snow, and Bilingual Education, co-edited with Fred Genesee. In addition to research, publishing, and professional development support, Dr. Christian also serves on numerous boards, including the Board of Directors for the International Research Foundation for English Language Education, the editorial board for the for the Heritage Language Journal, the editorial board of the International Journal on Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, and the editorial board of the New Journal of Immersion and Content-Based Education. She has also served several times as an officer and a member of the board of directors for the Joint National Committee for Languages. In 2006, she was awarded a Promoting Bilingualism Award by Two-Way Kabe, and she also received the 2011 Victoria A. Fromkin Lifetime Service Award from the Linguistic Society of America. Today, Dr. Christian will be opening our morning with her plenary entitled No Program is an Island, Policy Contexts for Immersion Education. As no immersion advocate is an island either, please join me in welcoming Donna Christian to the conference and thanking her for the presentation she is about to share.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, and thanks very much to Tara and Karen and the whole CARLA team for giving us this wonderful opportunity to come together and talk about immersion, and also, of course, for CARLA's leadership in the immersion education community year after year in between these wonderful conferences. With apologies to John Dunn, when I was asked for a title for this presentation, I immediately thought about all the complex, intertwined nature of policy contexts that determine whether immersion programs are available and how they may operate. No matter how great the idea for a program and how perfect the fit for the community and the school, immersion programs need to function within the policy context that surround them. The illusion here points to the interconnectedness of educational programs with influences inside and outside of education. And of course, this applies not just to immersion, for better and for worse. So I again with apologies to John Donne, thought, well, no program is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the school, district, community, state, nation, international, a part of the main. Further, programs and their people should not be alone in confronting these policy contexts. As Kathleen just mentioned, they can and should join together with others, other programs, communities, professional associations, to advocate for the best policies for their students. And conferences like this one give us a great opportunity to share and come together. I think just about all the, well, many of the dual language contexts that I'm going to mention this morning are represented in the conference participants and are very plentiful on the program. So I encourage you, if anything sounds particularly interesting, go find the people that are actually involved in it who can tell you more about their policy context, even if they're not directly reporting on it. Programs don't function on their own, independent of external influences. They are conditioned by, constrained by, the nested and multiple policy contexts in which they are embedded, as well as the sociolinguistic realities that surround them. And I think it's important, and I'll be talking about both as we go through this talk. The programs and the people in them can be actors or agents in setting policy and in advocating for or against particular policies. Immersion programs are in a unique intersection of policy areas. All education programs must respond to all these levels and types of policies related to education, such as the compulsory schooling for students of certain ages, graduation requirements, teacher qualifications. But immersion as a form of language education is also heavily influenced by the language policies and politics, overt or covert, that are part of the sociolinguistic context for the program. They are also, for better or worse, affected by the sociolinguistic reality of attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies about language and education, relating, of course, to broader issues of power, access, opportunity, and equality. Pointing to the role of ideology, Joshua Fishman, among others, has lamented, "Why are facts so useless in this discussion?" As he reminded us that discussions of bilingual or immersion education must always keep in mind the wider social and political context, including the positions and possible agendas of the commentators themselves. The debate about bilingual education in the United States is a classic example of this, where research on the outcomes of education using various bilingual approaches is routinely dismissed by those who oppose bilingual education because they don't believe it. Believe in quotes. Language and education policy is not unique in this, of course. Jay Green, commenting on the role of research and policy making for the National Association of State Boards of Education, observed, when research results are considered with findings from another study, are countered with findings from another study, policymakers, the press, and the attentive public tend to fall back on their ideology, interests, and biases. Another part of the sociolinguistic reality that must be acknowledged is the multilingual nature of most societies in the world, or plurilingualism. Much earlier language policy work was based on the concept of a nation-state with a single language. In this age of mobility and shifting political borders, this one nation, one language standard has all but disappeared, but it's still very prevalent in the ideologies. But we now hear about superdiversity. Blomert and Rampton observe, there is a growing awareness that over the past 2 decades, globalization has altered the face of social, cultural, and linguistic diversity in societies all over the world. Due to the diffuse nature of migration since the early 1990s, the multiculturalism of an earlier era, captured mostly in an ethnic minorities paradigm, has been gradually replaced by what can be called superdiversity. Superdiversity is characterized by a tremendous increase in the categories of migrants, not only in terms of nationality, ethnicity, language, and religion, but also in terms of motives, patterns, and itineraries of migration, and so on. This is the backdrop against which we can look at policy context for immersion education. My goal this morning is to address and illustrate three main points: how immersion education has grown and evolved in various policy contexts, how policy environments provide implementation spaces for local programs, and how implementers work within them or work to change them, and some promising strategies and some challenges that present themselves. We know there are always challenges. But first, let me say a few words about the policy contexts. We start with the fact that dual language approaches cut across somewhat distinct, though related, areas of the ideological and policy universe. One way, or sometimes called foreign language immersion, sits in the sociolinguistic arena of societal beliefs about and interest in learning languages other than the so-called majority or perhaps official languages. Motivators include diplomacy, commerce, national security, personal enrichment, and so on. Heritage language immersion connects to attitudes and beliefs about immigration, immigrants, and their benefit to society. An appreciation of cultural and linguistic diversity may play a role, as well as beliefs in language rights, and the concern in some areas for expanding national language resources for diplomacy, security, and so on. Indigenous language immersion relates more to attitudes and beliefs about indigenous communities and their rights, including language rights. Support can also come from an appreciation of cultural and linguistic diversity, coupled with a concern for endangered languages. Finally, two-way immersion cuts across these ideologies because it involves multiple communities: majority language speaking students and immigrant or indigenous speakers of another language. So it can, and it does, tap into all of these areas. All models, of course, benefit from approaches that see the value of additive bilingualism in education and the personal enrichment of knowing more than one language. But this is the ideal and an argument that may or may not be effective in opening up contexts for immersion. Turning now to policies. Sorry, these lines are a little faint. I don't have the greatest PowerPoint skills. As I mentioned earlier, policy is formulated overtly and covertly at all levels of government and institutions, from the more macro to the more micro. I'm sure that you can all think of policies that have affected your program at all of these levels. At the federal level, we have not only legislation, which is what people mostly think about, but also judicial decisions. In the United States, the famous Meyer versus Nebraska, where Nebraska had outlawed the teaching of German in the 1920s, and the Supreme Court overturned that. Regulations, legislation is often passed, but then it depends on the regulations that are formulated by specific agencies as to how that legislation will be implemented, if at all. And we've seen cases where legislation is passed, but no regulations are ever actually formulated, and therefore the law stands but isn't implemented. And of course, funding, our favorite topic. As we know, in the United States, for instance, the Foreign Language Assistance Program is part of legislation. It's part of the Department of Education, but its funding has been eliminated in the budget. So while we have a policy to provide assistance to foreign language programs, there is no funding, and so there really isn't any force behind that policy at the moment. One of the most basic national language policy decisions is the choice of one or more official languages, and that, of course, sets the tone for the possibility of immersion in languages other than one language. So, for instance, the Republic of Ireland, having declared Irish and English to be official languages, supports the desire to restore and revitalize the Irish language In contrast, the US has no official language policy at the federal level, despite attempts to make English the official language, and that's probably a good thing. In some nations, the educational curriculum is also controlled at the national level, so the role of languages in the school curriculum is also determined there. At the state level, in nations like the United States and Canada, education is the primary responsibility. And state education policy sets the parameters for curriculum, testing, teaching requirements, and so on. At the state level, we can also see official language designations. So for instance, we have the state of Hawaii, where Hawaiian has been made one of the official languages of the state, which is a helpful basic policy context to support Hawaiian immersion. Naturally, the state also gains power in these situations as the source of the major part of funding. Locally, school boards, central administration offices all set the stage for what programs can be offered, as well as the services that are provided to help teachers work in those programs and determine all kinds of policies, from transportation to various other outside of school options. Ophelia Garcia and Kate Mencken have a wonderful book on looking at agency in implementation, where they talk about how local educators enact language and education policies. They see language policy as dynamic, interactive, and a real-life process, and argue that local educators make choices as they implement policies, bringing their own perspectives and experience to their practice. And they note, as a result, policies in practice are far from uniform, and the top-down imposition of policy is met by the more bottom-up actions in schools and districts. Thus, there is a lot of power and action at the local level. And we also see policies, and I know that all of you are familiar with policies at the school level and at the program level, both for the use of languages, but also for other aspects of education that affect the possibility of immersion and how it is carried out. Finally, off on the corner, in some cases, international policies influence the possibilities of immersion. For example, the European Union has developed a policy for member nations that promotes the learning of the mother tongue plus 2 additional languages for all. This leads to a number of consequences for member nations. First, it promotes the protection of the rights of minority language speakers to maintain their community languages. And second, it promotes the learning of additional languages for everyone, starting in school and starting early. As typical, immersion is not specifically called for, but it provides for a context that we can say is kind of congenial to immersion. It can be rather exhausting, and I got a little exhausted, thinking about all the overlapping policy dimensions that play a role in making immersion programs possible, as well as the socio-linguistic realities that have to be taken into account. But this is the reality of the situation. Next, we can ask, what policy environments will allow implementation spaces for immersion, and how can we work toward them or within them? The notion of implementation spaces, which I'll be using a lot, was articulated by Hornberger and others, and it's helpful in thinking about how policy affects practice. These implementation spaces are agentive spaces in which local actors implement, interpret, and perhaps resist policy initiatives in varying and unique ways. The image leads us to see policy as it contributes to the openness of immersion spaces. It also recognizes the role of local actors, the educators, parents, community members, and so on, as the agents within these implementation spaces. I think of policy on a kind of a 5-point scale, as is shown on the slide, making it kind of a balance in terms of how policies help to open or close up these implementation spaces. In other words, how much room is there to establish immersion and have it thrive? Policies can, individually or in the aggregate, require immersion. The green are the more positive ones, the ones we want to hope will exist. So they can require immersion. I couldn't think of any. There may be some locally that require immersion as an approach, but I don't have any examples of that. But we do have examples of those that encourage immersion. The European language policy that supports the learning of multiple languages through schools and encourages learning languages to high proficiency sets the stage in a positive way for immersion. In the United States, there are a number of states, which you'll hear about if you come to the symposium at 10 o'clock, where policies have been put in place that are really encouraging immersion approaches to education. The kind of minimum are policies that allow immersion. In other words, they're basically silent. They don't encourage or discourage. They don't forbid in any way. They simply are around in ways that don't hamper the implementation of immersion. There are, unfortunately, a number of policies that don't actually prohibit immersion, but seriously discourage it for a variety of reasons. And one that we hear a lot about here in the United States relates to the assessment policies of No Child Left Behind, when assessments, high-stakes assessments, are required in English or in the national language. That can discourage some approaches to immersion, at least, where there's a fear that the language development will not be sufficient for students to show what they know and can do on these high-stake tests. Another area where there are policies on this continuum is the area of language rights. And although language rights are often the subject of specific policies, we usually don't find policies specifically about immersion education. Usually it's something more general, as in the examples I've mentioned, language education, graduation requirements, testing policies, and so on. That's why I like to think of this in terms of policy contexts or sets of policies on diverse matters that affect immersion. So let's turn to immersion specifically. I wanted to make a few comments about the history of immersion, and one of the main reasons is I love to have pictures of Wally Lambert and Russ Campbell for us to look at. In the 1960s, we know, Canada was moving toward affirmations of the equal status of French and English through a series of studies and commissions. There was the Official Languages Act, federal legislation, and a variety of other things that codified that status. During this time, the so-called quiet evolution of language and cultural resources between Francophone and Anglophone communities was going on in Canada. So in that context, in 1965, a group of Anglophone parents in a Montreal suburb worked with researchers at McGill, Wally Lambert and his colleagues, and the school district to develop a French immersion program for their children so that their children could develop high levels of proficiency in the language of the community around them. Their goal being for the children to become bilingual in the home language and in French. They believed this would give their children better opportunities for education and jobs in the future, but was certainly influenced by the policies and the attitudes around them. Although the federal government had no mandate with respect to education or immersion, its stance on the official language policy, along with public support for learning French at the local level, provided the implementation spaces for these programs and for these local actors to work on these programs. Immersion was a local response to the perceived need for language skills. It was allowed and perhaps even encouraged by the national and provincial language policies, enabled by the local school board, and clearly responded to the sociolinguistic context. As documented by the McGill researchers, the program also turned out to be effective in reaching academic and language goals. Now we have Russ here, because at the time the St. Lambert Immersion Program got underway, policymakers and educators in the United States were concerned about the availability of language resources. This is following World War II and the launch of Sputnik. There were these concerns. In particular, they were concerned about elementary and secondary schools not producing individuals with the kinds of language skills that we needed for a pipeline to post-secondary education that would allow for these language resources to be available. Russ Campbell was one of those individuals who felt that the investment of time and energy in language education wasn't yielding the results that met this need. He visited Professor Lambert and the St. Lambert program to find out more, and on returning from a visit to the St. Lambert French Immersion Program, and after extended consultation with students, parents, teachers, school officials, and McGill University participants in that program, this is Russ, approached Culver City, California Unified School District authorities to suggest the possible replication with only minor modifications of the St. Lambert program in an American setting. Those of you who knew Russ knew that he could be very persuasive, and there might be something to the individual champion here as well as how well it made sense. But the school district agreed to implement the model with the help of researchers from UCLA. In this case, there was no national language policy that supported the initiative, but national and state policies at the time, luckily, didn't get in the way, and the local school district adopted the program. The language of the immersion program in Culver City was Spanish rather than French, reflecting the geographical and demographic characteristics of Southern California. At the beginning, one elementary school was involved, and the students were primarily monolingual speakers of English. The St. Lambert model for language distribution was adopted with kindergarten and first grade classrooms using Spanish 100% of the time. Over time, immersion gained attention in other districts, and research results also began to appear that demonstrated the effectiveness of the approach in the US and Canada, and that helped to feed into later policy context. The expanding research base reassured schools that were considering this language education model, and the number of programs grew. With the expansion of immersion came offerings in languages other than Spanish, including French, Japanese, Mandarin, German, and a variety of others, and variations on the basic model were developed, including the 50-50 model. The Culver City schools recently celebrated their 40th anniversary of immersion, which is now in 2 elementary schools in the district, with continuation courses at the secondary level, and is offered in both Spanish and Japanese. As in many places, there are more applicants than spaces in the program, indicating their popularity. But like the St. Lambert program, most immersion programs have been local initiatives, with some notable exceptions in states more recently. Unlike Canada, however, the US has no official language or even strong federal policy encouraging the learning of languages other than English. Federal and state policies have allowed such programs for native English speakers, at least, I should add, assuming they meet the general education requirements, but didn't particularly encourage them with much funding or other kinds of incentives. So implementation spaces were open for local agents to work within. Just to illustrate, we can see the growth of language immersion in the United States based on the most recent update of the immersion directory at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and this is primarily one-way immersion. We know it's not all there are, so we encourage you to submit information about your programs. And also we can see some changes in the languages of immersion programs. And here we can see both sociolinguistic realities in terms of languages and communities, as well as the effect of some federal and state policies that are encouraging the growth of language programs in languages like Mandarin and not encouraging so much French and Spanish. So we see declines there and growth in some other languages for non-language reasons. We really need an international immersion directory so that these graphs could show what's going on around the world and not just in the United States. As the immersion model spread, it was also extended to heritage and indigenous language contexts, where an ethno-linguistic community language has declined in use, and an immersion language program seeks to reestablish the language among school-age children. For instance, in the case of the Hawaiian immersion program. There is some policy support from state and federal governments for indigenous language programs. The Declaration of Hawaiian as an official language in the state of Hawaii that I mentioned earlier was part of the environment for the establishment of the successful Hawaiian immersion program. Various federal laws in the United States, including the Native American Languages Act, have established a basic policy of support for Native American languages, with some funding made available for schools and communities for this purpose. I should note here that a lot of the literature that relates to Indigenous immersion contexts comes out of the mother tongue education policy literature from around the world. And this overlaps, of course, with Indigenous language immersion questions in both policy and practice. Interestingly, for Indigenous immersion, we also find some international support through organizations like UNESCO and regional initiatives like the circumpolar groups. For instance, the Inuit Circumpolar Council consists of Greenland, Canada, the United States, and Russia. And their goal is to promote the well-being of Arctic indigenous peoples, including promoting the indigenous language vitality in the Arctic. They call on Arctic states to make resources available for these purposes, and they also recommend that education policies for indigenous languages must include opportunities for all indigenous peoples, including people of all ages, to achieve and maintain high levels of competence in their mother tongue. They call for education policies to further include mechanisms and incentives for training and retaining indigenous educators at all levels. Again, immersion education is not mentioned specifically, but these recommendations to national governments, if taken seriously, would promote a positive policy environment for such programs to operate. Finally, extension of the original one-way immersion model has brought together students from two different language backgrounds in two-way immersion. Federal policy, perhaps surprisingly, actually did play a role here. The US government funded a research center based at UCLA in the mid-1980s to examine, among other things, the ways in which bilingual education and foreign language education could come together to benefit all students. The center's leaders included, not surprisingly, Russ Campbell, Dick Tucker. The advisory board counted Wallace Lambert and Meryl Swain on its members. And center researchers included Catherine Linton Leary and people from Cal documented two-way programs and worked with local school districts who wanted to try the approach. Federal policy also served as an incentive briefly because of discretionary funding designated for developmental and bilingual and two-way programs. But unfortunately, these particular policy pushes were somewhat short-lived, and support for two-way immersion has come more from the educational side, supporting the educational excellence for Hispanic students, in particular, because most of the programs are in Spanish and English, and there we see a lot more policy activity that figures into the policy context for two-way immersion. And two-way immersion grew as well. Now I'd like to turn to a couple of cases of immersion education and think about how the implementation spaces were made available for them. I'm going to mention, again, programs and national contexts that are represented here, and I hope that you'll talk to the people involved. First, Swedish in Finland. There is an active and thriving Swedish immersion program in Finland. The federal language policy, Finland is officially bilingual, Finnish and Swedish. And the sociolinguistic reality of 90% of the Finns speak Finnish natively and 5.5% are Swedish native speakers. The context of federal education policy and the national school system guarantees monolingual education in the native language for both Swedish and Finnish speakers, as well as providing language instruction in at least 2 other languages, consistent with the European Union policy. But beginning in 1987, Swedish immersion was made available for Finnish speakers who chose that, and those were people who had no Swedish spoken in the home, but they were interested in learning the other official language and the language of the neighbor and of neighbors within the country. From the first program in 1987, over the next 20 years, it grew from 25 children to 4,500 students in kindergarten through 2nd grade. And the demand, as in other places for the program, is larger than the number of spaces. The model was similar to the Canadian model, but was affected by national education policy in that students' first languages were the student's first language, Finnish, was introduced in grade 1 rather than waiting until later. The program, given this congenial policy context, has a strong position in the Finnish educational system, and it suits the sociolinguistic reality well, produces good results, and has a good implementational space within the language and education policy environment. A number of Indigenous language immersion programs around the world are also good examples of influences of policy contexts. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but we know about the Basque immersion programs in the Basque country, and of course that language was not allowed for a number of years, but at a point, although Spanish is was only the official language at the national language, regions were allowed to have other languages, and in the Basque country, Basque is the official language along with English. There are very positive attitudes toward Basque in that country, and people generally think it should be learned in school. This sets a good stage for the bilingual programs or the immersion programs in Basque, and from the early 1980s to 2004-05, 12% of the programs, 12% of the students in the bilingual programs were in immersion at the beginning, and in the 2004 year, 50% of students were in immersion, showing the growth in the adoption of that model. In Ireland, we have the same European context promoting the learning of at least 2 languages in addition to the mother tongue. And a similar context in that the national context in Ireland has both Irish and English as official languages. But the sociolinguistic reality is that Irish as the indigenous language was declining, and English was used by many, not all, but many communities. There were communities of Irish speakers, but they were fewer and fewer, and there was a strong sense of a need for revitalization efforts. Surveys of language attitudes showed positive feelings toward Irish as a marker of identity and history. So there was a lot of support for revitalization efforts. The national government commissioned, in support of these efforts, commissioned a 20-year strategy for the Irish language, and the goals were to increase the ability or capacity to use the language, using schools as an important tool in that. In addition, there were a goal of increasing the opportunities for using the language and continuing to foster positive attitudes. The strategy also has a very specific goal to increase the number who speak Irish on a daily basis outside education from 72,000 to 250,000 by 2028. The strategy is in the early stages of implementation. It was published in late 2010, but there is a cabinet-level committee on the Irish language, and it's overseeing the strategy, and national attention to the language and language revitalization efforts continue. So here we see a potentially wide implementation space for immersion education within the national policy context, as well as within the sociolinguistic context of attitudes toward the development and maintenance of Irish in the country. Two-way immersion in the United States. Again, I don't have a lot of time to go through the details, but I would mention in Arlington, Virginia, this program, which has grown and succeeded over the years, was very much a part of the early federal research and policy context that I spoke about before, in that researchers from CLEAR, the research center, worked with the educators in Arlington, and in particular arranged for visits to a bilingual program in Hartford, Connecticut, where the principal of one of the schools realized that he really wanted all of his students to have the chance to become bilingual, and there were large numbers of Spanish speakers and English speakers in his school, and he saw the possibilities for two-way immersion. Up to that point, the county had been what's called an all-ESL county. There were no bilingual programs, but he managed to garner support, and the following fall, after the visit to the bilingual program, began the two-way immersion program, which is now in Arlington at the Key Elementary School, and throughout is articulated with programs from K through 12 in Arlington. Very successful, and as in other programs with waiting lists. But it depended, I should mention, on the ability to get other educational policies in line. For instance, because immersion is always a choice, it's always voluntary for parents, the school district moved to not because of that, but the school district had a cluster model where groups of elementary schools served a region. And so parents who wanted to opt into Key could do that from outside the immediate Key boundaries, but those who didn't had other choices within the cluster. So those kinds of policies are very important to enable programs like immersion. Okay. I'd like to move now to talking about some strategies and challenges and then wrap up. Within a national policy context, we still want to look for these little doors that can open into implementation spaces that can promote various factors that support immersion. And one of the most promising that I've seen develop recently is the incentive of a seal of biliteracy that students can earn at high school graduation when they demonstrate that they have high levels of proficiency in two languages, English and another language in the states involved. It was originally developed by a non-governmental coalition called Californians Together, but has recently been enacted in legislation in California. And in California, it's reported that 165 school districts are now giving these awards. And in 2012, at the graduation this past June, over 10,000 graduating seniors received a seal of biliteracy and a medallion. The medallion is pictured here. It's important to note that the criteria are rigorous, and there are a number of ways in which students must demonstrate their language proficiency in English and in another language, and it's open to native speakers of English and native speakers of other languages who develop these high levels of proficiency. In addition, the students must apply, so this gets into students' minds that there is this award that may be helpful in finding jobs, that certainly shows that something is valued by the school system and the state, and they need to start thinking about that early on, and there are ways of making them aware of it, which also then is motivating for participating in programs like immersion. Happily, in this past year, New York State also enacted legislation similar to create a state seal of biliteracy. There are other possibilities, and I think I put information sharing, which is rather kind of global. But I think if we think about the Arlington example, where a visit by educators from one district visiting another district, where information was shared about how immersion or bilingual education in that case works and the benefits for the students, I think that the educator-to-educator information sharing is a very powerful tool for coping with or thinking about policies and how you can open up the implementation spaces within a policy framework. Conferences like this give great opportunities for people to talk to one another about how they're dealing with challenges or how they're making the most of a policy that one wouldn't have thought was actually supportive of immersion, but turns out to be. I also think it's useful to think about other areas that are being talked about a lot as national priorities, state priorities, local priorities, and figure out, to say, the angle in which immersion supports that. So for instance, we hear a lot about international assessments and how well or how not so well our students are doing on them in reading and math and so on. Well, we can make some connections. What are some of the countries that are doing well that we're being compared to? A country like Singapore. Gee, what happens in education? Well, they have multiple languages in education. Students learn multiple languages. Gee, and we know there are connections between language learning and academic achievement or cognition or whatever. So if we want to compete, we should have more languages in our schools. Looking at opportunities like that. Another area is for jobs. A recent policy proposal that came out of the Council on Foreign Relations in June, this past June, advocates a Languages for Jobs initiative, thinking about language as a strategic economic asset in an increasingly competitive international economy. They make recommendations for federal action that include develop and promote foreign language immersion as part of core content learning and beginning at primary level, and providing support for teacher development. Now, to be fair, I should mention that that report was authored by people from the Center for Applied Linguistics, but it is on the Council for Foreign Relations website as a memo. And of course, we have all of the national security, diplomacy, and commerce arguments that we can feed into, and we all know what those are. Finally, in the strategies, I just want to mention the recent advent of language roadmaps, which I think are a marvelous way to bring attention to language. At the moment, they're within states and in some cities. They were initiated as a federal initiative, the National Security Education Program, in collaboration with other departments, unfortunately not the Department of Education, but Labor and Commerce. And Oregon, Texas, and Ohio were among the first to develop these roadmaps, which are a statement in the state of recommendations for how the state can embrace the learning of multiple languages and why this is good for that state. And so they're contextualized within a state, but also provide this very broad policy context. And interestingly, all of the language roadmaps that have been developed mention immersion, dual language in some way or another in their recommendations, showing that this approach can help achieve the goals of the language roadmap. Finally, and I should mention that if we want to hear more about state-level initiatives, the symposium that follows this is going to feature a number of states that are doing some exciting things, including coming out of these language roadmaps. And this is encouraging news from these states, and we can just imagine what recommendations like this in every state would do to help the national context for immersion education. So this relates both to practice and to advocacy. We need to figure out ways to work within the existing policy contexts and implementation spaces, share with others, and work to create new and expanded implementation spaces through new and expanded or improved policies. I'm not going to say much about it. I just mentioned that there are resources for people who are interested in engaging in advocacy. The Joint National Committee for Languages, languagepolicy.org, has a video on language advocacy, making your voice count. ACTFL has state-level advocacy teams and materials on you don't have to be an experienced lobbyist. Lots of professional associations and organizations, Californians Together that I just mentioned, do provide guidance on advocacy so that it can be undertaken in your own context. One thing that I note, again, speaking in the US context, that is verges on a challenge. It's kind of the tipping point between opportunities and challenges. We find, in a puzzling way, that despite the lack of policy support in a lot of ways for language learning in schools, there's broad-based public opinion that it's a good idea. So there was a NAFSA survey, and nearly 2/3 of Americans surveyed believed that people need to learn foreign languages. There are many other surveys that could be cited that come up with similar findings, and yet, why is it still so hard to get the positive policy context if the sociolinguistic reality of attitudes, at least, believes this? That's not the only challenge. We have a number of challenges that we need to face. A big one is policies related to teacher requirements and teacher recruitment. Who can teach in these programs and what credentials do they need to have? There are a number of responses, and I know there are going to be some talks about that here, through alternative licensing processes, assistance from embassies in bringing teachers who are native speakers of the languages of instruction, visiting teacher programs, and so on. Indigenous programs can often look elsewhere for teachers, however, and there's a lovely description of the work at the Cochiti Pueblo by Mary Eunice Romero Little, who says, and I'm going to take a minute just to read this, in Cochiti, for example, in planning and implementation of its language renewal initiative, there was a conscientious decision to always employ the Cochiti way. Therefore, in the search for teachers for our first ever summer language immersion program, instead of publicly advertising these positions and requiring applicants to complete application forms, we visited Keres-speaking community members in their homes, and with cornmeal and prayer in Keres, the traditional form of making a request, asked for their assistance and involvement as teachers in the program. In this special way, as some of the few remaining fluent speakers of Keres, they instantly understood the significance of this new endeavor and accepted our request. So we also know that we need to find ways that work within the local sociolinguistic, sociocultural context. Articulation, I know that you all can fill in the blanks here. Articulation across educational levels and between community programs and schools is always an issue. How does policy support better articulation? Assessment policies is a big one here in the United States. We know that at one point there was talk of having a NAEP, a National Assessment of Education Progress, in Spanish at least, which would signify attention to language at the national level because it's being measured, but that has been set aside for now. And we have the challenges of No Child Left Behind with assessments in English only, which are not necessarily the best. Independent of what we think about having high stakes assessment at all, the language of the assessments may not fit the educational profile of immersion program students. And finally, national level educational movements such as core standards in the United States are a concern, and these are growing policy contexts that in now and for the next few years, immersion programs are going to have to be thinking about how can we work within this core standards context. So, to conclude, as I hope these examples illustrate, the achievement of our language goals through immersion education requires support from educational policies at all levels, federal, state, local, or even international. A systemic approach is needed. Legislation will not make a difference without implementing regulations and funding that move in the same direction. In the US, the most recent major elementary secondary education law, No Child Left Behind, is silent on language education for languages other than English, and the silence speaks volumes. But it explicitly requires that English proficiency outcomes demonstrate annual progress for non-native speakers and discourages native language development through its assessment requirements. Policies on the use of languages other than English for instruction are primarily left to states and local districts, but functioning within this federal context. There has been some encouraging leadership from the Defense Department, illustrated by the language roadmaps I mentioned, and also some funding for K-12 programs, interestingly enough. But we need overall a broad and consistent policy orientation that encourages all students to become proficient in 2 or more languages, and that provides supports and incentives for schools, and for teachers, and for students. And all the relevant policies in this ideal world would be aligned. They would encourage high-quality, well-articulated K-12 school-based dual language programs. They would include proficiency in languages other than English among core areas of achievement that will be measured and accounted for, both locally and in national assessments. They will give credit and provide incentives for individual students who achieve high levels of proficiency in their native language and at least one other language. They will include in standards for teacher preparation for all teachers the understanding of language learning, awareness of the value of language proficiency, and knowledge of ways to support heritage and second language development. So we can count on all the teachers, all the educators, not just those in our program, to understand and support the goals of the program. And they will expand availability of high-quality teacher preparation programs to prepare dual language teachers to increase the availability of effective teachers in a wide variety of languages. In conclusion, I'd like to return to the notion of implementation spaces made available by policy contexts. If they prohibit or discourage, those are areas for action about the policy, for work with policymakers to change the orientation. Policies that allow, or even better, encourage immersion can be thought of as in the implementation zone, and local educators and communities should make the most of them. We need local agents to fill these implementation spaces with one-way, Indigenous, heritage, and 2-way immersion, in line with the local sociolinguistic reality. And we need to work toward policies at national and at all institutional levels that create policy contexts and implementation spaces that will support a system where immersion education in all its forms is not only allowed, but encouraged and supported. Thank you.